G'day ladies and gents, welcome to War Thunder with Mags. So today we're not going to be doing a direct gameplay, so to speak. Today we're going to be talking about bombers. Now, bombers get a lot of backlash amongst the community for some of the things that people do with them, certain exploits with the way they operate. But I don't want this to become a negative discussion. What I'm going to discuss today is why bombers act the way they act, what issues that bombers come across, because a lot of the time I see discussions from fighter pilots complaining about bombers, but I never really see the bomber pilots get to defend themselves or explain why certain things work the way they work. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to look at some of the problems that bombers actually face within War Thunder, and almost all of them are due to poor implementation, and we're going to have a little bit of a discussion about potential things that could be changed within the gameplay that would correct these issues and make bombers more interesting to fly, and more rewarding to fly overall. Now, in the comment section for this video, if somebody doesn't agree with some of the stuff that I'm saying, feel free to point it out. You know, I want everybody's opinions in on this, but I also want you guys to take the opportunity here to give your own ideas on particular things that could be done to improve bomber gameplay in War Thunder. So first things first, we're going to talk about the jet bombers, the spaceships, and I've specifically selected the Cannon Canberra because it is one of the most complained about bombers in the game. Part of the reason why it's complained about so heavily is because of its capabilities. This thing, it is actually quite easy, when it's clear of its bomb load, to get this thing up to 40,000 feet, where it's almost impossible for things to actually be able to catch it. At around 25,000 feet, and you'll actually see me do it in this video, I have to pull back on the throttles, and I fly this thing only at 60%. Why do I fly this bomber only at 60%? Well, at 25,000 feet, if I fly it at 100%, I have to deploy the air brakes about every 30 seconds to prevent it from overspeeding and ripping off its own wings. That's how fast this thing is at altitude. And this isn't exactly something that's wrong with its flight model either. There is a reason why NASA's premier high-altitude research aircraft is still a modified B-57. It's a Canberra that the Americans modified, and then NASA made a few more modifications to. Now, in the 2 minutes that I've been talking so far, just introducing this, I've already crossed from the bomber spawn point in this Canberra to the first bombing target. First 3 bombs are away, that's enough to destroy the base. Begin my bank around, line up the second bombing target. Now the Canberra is already moving so fast that I'm not going to be able to get the bomb sight on the middle target, so I immediately have to line up the third one. Now you're probably going to say, you're only doing 525 kilometers an hour. This is entirely true, in indicated airspeed. I'm also on my approach to 22,000 feet. Now that means I'm actually doing around 760 kilometers an hour true airspeed, and this aircraft rips its wings at 860. And the truth of how fast I'm moving is shown in the time to target. The first bombs have only just fallen from 22,000 feet and impacted the base, blowing it up, and I'm almost lined up for the release of my remaining 2 bombs. Now these aren't enough to take out this base, but it'll take out 2/3 of its health. I need one more bomb to be able to complete this job. Now in this particular battle, I am the only bomber on the team, so I don't have enough firepower to be able to take out all of these bases. Last 2 bombs are away, that's going to take out 2/3 of the last base's health. That leaves a third, plus 1 full base, and then the entirety of the runway, which will take 2 to 3 full bomb loads in order to take out. And this is a 5,000 pound bomb load. It's the maximum bomb load that the Cannon Canberra can actually carry. Now why I'm beginning to descend and drop altitude so I can cut around a wide section and get a line up on the runway to land and rearm my bombs as far away from enemy fighters as I possibly can, it's worth pointing out that this is the point where those bombers that would climb the Canberra into space would start climbing. So, why here? Well, have a look at what's just happened. I've dropped my 5 bombs, that's all I could carry. I've done the maximum amount of damage, I didn't miss anything. And at this point, I can no longer directly influence the battle through bombing. Now this particular bomber is the Cannon Canberra. It has an awesome amount of firepower, it's incredibly maneuverable. I could try and fly this thing like a fighter, and it can be somewhat effective in the right hands. At least if there are targets around that are stupid enough to let you engage or let you get the drop on them. But if the enemy team is fairly switched on, the enemy fighters that I'm fighting against are 200 kilometers an hour faster than my wing rip speed. They can simply outrun me. They're generally just as maneuverable, if not more maneuverable than I am. Those few that aren't are able to break a distance to re-engage, and I'm engaging aircraft like the MiG-15 Biz in this match. They've got a 37mm that can one-shot my aircraft. Now, of course, you could return to base and rearm your bombs and try and make another bombing pass, but look at the size of the maps and the distance between the runways. You saw how quickly I moved from the bomber spawn point to the first bomb target, which is not far from the Russian runway. The Russian jets are faster than the Canberra is. If they see you go in for landing, they can hit you and destroy you faster than you can put your wheels on the ground, let alone get back off the runway again. If one of them just happens to be loitering in the area, they can one-shot your aircraft. Now, in this particular battle, my team's going very well. There's only 2 aircraft remaining on the enemy team. One's a CL-13, the other is a MiG-15 Biz. I don't know where the Biz is, but the CL-13 is just ahead of me, and I'm the kind of pilot that would run in the first place, so I'm moving in to try and engage the CL-13. But just for a moment, picture this map in reverse, where the Russian forces were winning and the American forces were almost gone, or you were potentially the last aircraft remaining on the match. You've just done a perfect mission. You've done exactly what your bomber is designed to do within the match. And you're likely about to pay a repair bill for no fault of your own. Now, I'm not discounting that all bomber pilots are thinking this way. There are some that do climb to space just to be pricks, and that's what they do. This is the internet. There are arseholes everywhere. This is entirely normal. But a lot of bomber pilots are simply trying to avoid paying the repair bill. At the point that they start running, they don't really care if they win or lose anymore. In fact, they would probably like the battle to end as soon as you could possibly end it. They just don't want to pay a repair bill after holding up their end of the bargain and having a team that failed at doing its job. And the current meta and design for the game doesn't allow them to get their bomber back into the fight without putting it in a situation where it is almost 100% guaranteed to die. So, let's break down the core problem with jet bombers, and this actually applies to almost all heavy bombers as well. The problem is it is unsafe to land a jet bomber on the ground to grab bombs. As a general rule, the speed of the aircraft is too low, and the landing time is too long for them to be able to get to a bomb site, get back, land, rearm their weapons, and then get back into the fight at an acceptable rate. And it's also kind of ludicrous to consider that heavy bombers and jet bombers would be landing so close to enemy fighter contingents. You would never do that. So how do you fix the issue with the bombers? How do you get them to stop running to 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 feet? How do you get them to stay in the fight and keep dropping bombs to affect the outcome of the battle? Basically, how do you change the current meta? Here's an idea to consider. What about a mid-air reload point? Now, I'm not talking about an arcade style, you drop your bombs and you immediately get a timer that you have to wait through and then you get all your bombs back. That would be stupid. I would hate that. But let's say, for example, in this mission, I've got 2 bombs left at the moment. I'm about to make a U-turn, line back up on a bomb site, release my last 2 bombs. At that point, I am now out of bombs. At a random point on my side of the map, I suddenly got a navigational marker. If you've played through the tutorials, you would have seen these in game. They're generally just a big orange circle that floats in the sky. That navigational marker will be on the very edge of the map, where normally you would hit the boundary for the map and, respawn back in, heading back towards the battlefield. And that navigational point would be at bomber altitudes. So it would be at bomber altitude, spawning point is about 9 to 10,000 feet, so it would be at about 9 to 10,000 feet. If the bomber flies to that point, it will despawn from the match, and it will go through a 60-second timer where the player can no longer deploy it on the battlefield. Now, if the team's fighters are destroyed, all their aircraft are destroyed, while the bomber is in this timer, the match ends, because the bomber is obviously not on the field. However, if the timer completes, the bomber will respawn at one of, say, we don't want to camp bomber spawn points, so let's say 3 positions on the map, 3 random positions on the map that are all on the Allied side that are at normal bomber spawn altitude and can be redeployed with a full bomb load. Now, this would have 2 effects on how these bombers were flown. Firstly, it would allow bombers a reliable way of rearming their aircraft without putting their aircraft at unacceptable to ludicrous levels of risk, depending on the size of the map. And this would also encourage the bombers to keep dropping bombs, keep earning RP, keep earning silver lions. It keeps the battle flowing. And to a bomber pilot, if they have the ability to get more bombs and continue dropping them, the risk of staying at altitude and continuing to actively engage within the battle would be worth more than the risk of losing your aircraft, because suddenly you have a way of reliably being able to drop enough that if you happen to lose your plane, well, if you drop enough bombs, you cover your own repair bill, you probably make a profit. Since most bomber pilots that aren't being arseholes have a tendency to run because there is no longer a way for them to affect the battle, this gives them an opportunity to be able to continue affecting the battle. this also has a really nice side effect of, you know, if you run your plane out to 30,000-40,000 feet, you can no longer take the bomb reload, because it's at 10,000 feet. You'd have to descend at some point if you want to get more bombs to re-engage in the fight. Now, if a bomber pilot does try and be an arsehole and climb all the way out to altitude when he has the opportunity to continue in the fight, well, then he's screwing over his own team just as much as he's screwing over yours, and is generally going to be frowned upon by everybody involved. As I said earlier, this is the internet. It's not going to stop every bomber pilot from running, but it will give a large number of bomber pilots a reason not to run. Now, for those who are looking for a realism argument of why would there be a mid-air reload, well, from a realism standpoint, it would signify an area where a bomber with a depleted bomb load has exited the battle, and 60 seconds later, a new fresh bomber coming from an airfield far outside of the combat zone, the kind of place you would station a bomber, arriving on the battlefield to continue bombing operations. Now, I used jet bombers as an example on that last one, but it also applies to 4-engined heavy bombers, things like the B-17, the Lancasters, and of course even little 4-engine bombers like this one, the Focke-wulf 200 Condor. Now, I'm going to use the Condor for the rest of this video, and I'm going to display a couple of other problems that bombers run into, and things that, well, in all honesty, this is kind of ridiculous. For starters, this is the Norway map. Now, firstly, look at the flak around these 3 bombing targets. This is absolutely insane, and consider, you know, this is a battle rating 3 match. Now, first things first, it doesn't actually make a lot of sense for the Condor to have anything to bomb at all on Norway. The Norway map is supposed to signify Norway as being totally German controlled and an allied force pushing an invasion into Norway, so you wouldn't expect them to be any bombing targets. It doesn't make a huge amount of sense to begin with. But it is potential if you were to think of them not as factories and hardened facilities as what you see down there, but as forward operating bases. So okay, we'll make the assumption that that's what they're supposed to be. In the end, it doesn't really matter for the discussion of this particular issue that bombers, especially low-level ones, run into. This particular map, the transit time from the bomber spawn point to get to these 3 bases is about 15 minutes, and look at the flak you run into. I was actually very lucky I was able to get my Condor in and out of this location without being pulled to pieces. Now, in the time it's taken me to fly and release my bombs, my entire team has been pulled apart. It is 4 on 2, and the only remaining aircraft on the German team is my Condor and a Russian AR-2. Yep, this was a mixed battle. I've been getting a huge number of these recently. Now, at the moment, my Condor isn't fully upgraded. I don't have access to the maximum bomb load, which means the best I could do with my entire bomb load after 15 minutes of flight and having to deal with that level of flak was to take out 3/4 of the base's health. Now, the AR-2 that's flying with me is fully upgraded, and it has a bomb load that is comparable to my own, which means all it can do is either finish off the base that I've got or take out 3/4 of the next base. For a single Condor, even on maximum bomb load, it can only take out 1 base. So it would take 3 trips. So you've got the from spawn point to bomb zone, which is 15 minutes. You've then got 15 minutes return. You'd say at least 5 minutes to land, rearm, and retake off and get back under your way. 15 minutes transit back to blow up the second base. Repeat that process again. Well, you begin to see the problem. In a single bomber situation, there isn't actually enough time in the match for a single Condor to be able to take out the 3 bombing zones on the Norway map before the match naturally runs out of time. It would take over an hour to complete all 3 bases. The second problem is that blowing up these bases makes absolutely no difference to the outcome of the battle. They're just somewhere for the bombers to drop their bombs. Getting Norway in a bomber on the German side is sort of like getting the booby prize. Even if you had a multi-bomber formation and could take out all the bases in one pass, it doesn't matter. They don't influence the battle in any way. So what's the point of bombing stuff in the first place? And this is the major second issue that bombers run into, and it's not just the Norway map. This happens on a lot of maps. Irrelevance. You bring a bomber into a map, and it doesn't matter what you do, it doesn't matter how well you play, it doesn't matter how much stuff you blow up, it really doesn't make too much of a difference. Now, there is of course soft targets that you could potentially try and bomb, but if you tried to hit a moving patrol boat with a 250 kilo bomb from a Condor, if you don't directly hit the boat with pinpoint precision, the bomb hits the water next to the boat and doesn't detonate. Things like Condors and heavy bombers are not designed for precision bombing. That's what dive bombers and light bombers were designed for. but there's currently no control to keep them from maps where they really don't serve a purpose, and this frustrates the hell out of bomber pilots. To put this into perspective for those of you who only fly fighters, imagine spawning into a map in, say, a 50 caliber machine gun armed fighter with no bombs, and you had no bomb load available. And this map had no aircraft that you could engage. There was nothing for you to actually shoot down. All you could do is shoot the ground targets. But the only ground targets that counted were heavy tanks that were immune to your 50 caliber machine gun fire. The trucks that were available for you to blow up and earn a little bit of a score on were irrelevant to the outcome of the battle. That would be the frustration level that bombers face daily. So, again, breaking it down, core problem: poor map design and poor bombing target implementation, leading bombers, especially low-level bombers, regularly in situations where they have nothing to do. So, what would be a change to this? Well, how about, for starters, we drop the health on the bombing targets to the point where a bomber of the level that has been deployed in the match is actually capable of destroying the bases. That would be a really nice start. However, that still brings about the whole question of what happens when those bases are pretty much irrelevant to the outcome of the match. You want destroying those targets to actually have an effect. So back at the start I said, think of these more as forward operating bases. If you were to picture those as being an island that's been taken by the Allies, it's being run as a land-based command centre for an invasion force, what would happen if you were to destroy the chain of command during an invasion? So, what happens if you were to change the AI so that they were tied into the bases? So rather than just blowing up the bases in order to maybe unlock a third target that you can blow up to end the match, destroying the bases would affect how the AI within the match performed. So let's say you destroy one of the bases and the invasion ships scatter, become less organised, move slower. Some might even turn around and try and retreat back to their ships. This would increase the time it took for the Allied invasion or the Allied landing craft to be able to capture the enemy base in order to give the Allied invasion forces a runway to rearm at. Destroy two bases and the battleships that are deploying the invasion fleet on the Norway map would start to turn and try and head back towards open water. This would again increase the time it takes to cap out the runway if it hadn't already been capped, but also removes some of the AAA and artillery support that is available from those ships on that particular island. Now, these are two ideas for just debuffs to the enemy team by blowing up their bases, but what about blowing up the enemy bases to generate buffs for your own? Let's say, just for example, we blow up the third base, and rather than doing something negative to the enemy team, it instead spawns a set of landing craft that make their way towards the runway on Norway, the cappable runway, and tries to capture it back. Now you can take this line of thinking even further and go, well, what happens if you don't have 3 stagnant bases? What happens if you had, say, 10 or 15 positions across the map that would randomly get 3 bases spawned in them, and every time you blew up one, a new one would respawn? These bases would then become dynamic. Destroying them would either debuff the enemy team or buff your own, specifically affecting the AI ground forces on the map. All of a sudden, having control of the bombing sites or having the control of bombers on a map, being able to influence those ground forces could turn the tide. On a map, for example, like Hokkaido, British forces, which are normally permanently on the defensive, as opposed to American forces which are on the offensive, could destroy a set of key dynamic bases on the map, which would allow them to spawn in their own tanks that would actively move out of their defensive line and engage the American tanks. For the Americans, they could destroy a set of dynamic bases which may spawn defensive lines of their own. If you were to couple that with the mid-air respawn mechanic that I mentioned earlier on, all of a sudden you have a dynamic battlefield where the bombers, instead of just trying to blow things up on the ground and hope they don't get shot down, are now trying to attack specific parts of the map in order to try and change the way the ground forces on the map are operating. Now, this makes more sense from a realism standpoint. Think about Berlin. American heavy bombers pounded Berlin into the ground, but Germany didn't surrender because American heavy bombers pounded the city almost to dust. They surrendered because Russian and American tanks were rolling down their main streets. It wasn't until ground forces invaded and captured the city that Germany finally surrendered and the European theatre of World War II came to an end. A dynamic base setup, in conjunction with a mid-air reload, would allow bombers to try and facilitate that ground forces invasion by lending support via bombing. It sort of fits together. Now, of course, that does leave one big question. What about bomber spam? Well, What if the bombers can't directly end the battle themselves? They're 100% reliant on the ground forces. So for example, destroying 3 bases will not allow you to bomb out the enemy runway. Let's say for example you can bomb out the enemy runway, but instead of destroying the base and instantly ending the match, destroying the enemy runway will instead double or triple the repair time for any aircraft that lands there. So to visualize this as a series of mechanics, fighters fight. They do what they do. Their goal is to try and achieve total air domination of the entire map. If they manage to do that, if they manage to wipe out the entirety of the enemy team, they generate a victory. Attackers and dive bombers, light bombers, try and eliminate all of the enemy mobile vehicles that are on the ground. They attempt to eliminate everything that they possibly can. The more that they eliminate, if they manage to eliminate all of the enemy's mobile ground forces and defences, they win the match. Heavy bombers currently try and do the same job as light bombers and dive bombers. In this situation, heavy bombers will be trying to bomb strategic targets that are placed across the map that will influence how many ground forces are available and what they're doing and how they're performing on the ground. 3 distinct battles, 3 distinct realms of influence for each of the aircraft core types, all happening on the same map at the same time. And the best teams will be the ones that have the optimal mix of all. Suddenly, heavy bombers won't need to madly rush in on targets. They can take their time to set themselves up and work out what they need to take out in order to assist the battle. Suddenly fighters will become very interested in defending those heavy bombers because keeping them alive is in their best interest. Heavy bomber spam doesn't become too much of an issue because, why, a team of heavy bombers would of course be able to very rapidly influence the actions of the ground forces within a map. Those ground forces still are moving at the speed that a tank moves across the ground, and it's going to be highly unlikely that the bombers are going to be able to get the ground forces to, say, capture the enemy runway and finish the match, which would be the endgame requirement that I would be thinking for this kind of a setup, faster than the enemy team's fighters could kill all your heavy bombers. And running for the stars suddenly becomes a lot less appealing as you no longer have the ability to generate RP or silver lines if you do so, and you no longer have any influence or control on the match. Now, I said before, dropping the health of each of the strategic targets. This has another added side effect in that environment too, as it means, well, right now, I did a calculation a little while ago. On certain maps under certain conditions, it's actually impossible for fighters to be able to win a ground forces match if all the bombers on their team have been eliminated and somebody's running for space, because they simply don't carry enough ordnance to take down all the ground targets that are required in order to change the outcome of the battle. But with the health of the strategic targets drop, if the fighters were to land and load up bombs, and instead of going after the tanks that are on the map, instead destroy a strategic target that allowed a spawn of their own tanks, or reduce the effectiveness of the enemy tanks by maybe increasing the effectiveness of their own defences, or whichever way the buffs were implemented, fighters could take out these strategic targets as well. If you abandon the battle to go to space, you are actively ruining your own team's chances of winning. And in a combat environment and a new game meta like this, I don't think it would take too long before running to space was frowned upon in much the same way that team killing is. Now, are these ideas ideal? I doubt it. I can poke a few holes in a few of my ideas already. I'm sure you guys in the comment sections are going to poke holes in more. And I hope you do. But at the same time, I hope everybody takes a bit of an opportunity here to drop a few ideas of your own. The core problem with bombers at the moment, heavy bombers and jet bombers specifically, is they're so limited in what they can actually do in the battle. These ideas are just that. They're just a couple of ideas. I don't think they should be implemented. They're just me spitballing a few things to get people's minds thinking on ways that bombing and, in general, overall game dynamics of War Thunder could be changed in order to improve the game, to create a more dynamic and interesting environment where everybody has a way of influencing the battle, where actually having a mix of aircraft is going to improve your chances. Right now, the honest truth, the current meta for War Thunder, the ideal team is 16 fighters that are as powerful as you can possibly get. No bombers, no attackers. You will win more quickly and more reliably with 16 bombers than you will with anything else, short of those very short maps where it's highly likely that a number of bombers can get through to hit ground targets and the base before they can be intercepted. On those very small maps, the ultimate dynamic is 16 heavy bombers and everyone suicide rushes the bases and the runway. this isn't particularly interesting for anybody involved. So, as I said, this is just the ways that I'm trying to come up with to make bombing more interesting and the gameplay in general more interesting. What do you guys think? What ideas have you had? What has crossed your mind? Let me know in the comments section. Until next time, click like if you do, subscribe if you want to see more. Fly smart, fly safe. I'll catch you in the skies.